What happens when radical ideas turn deadly? Tonight on Up in Crime, we uncover the chilling story of a cult that left a trail of murder across 3 states: Vermont, Pennsylvania, and California. A group that started as an intellectual movement with ideas about ethics and philosophy spiraled into violence, conspiracy, and death. At the center of it all is Jack LaSota, better known as Ziz, a self-proclaimed visionary whose extreme beliefs turned followers into killers. From a deadly shootout at the U.S. border to a brutal double homicide and a landlord's murder, the Zizian cult's violent footprint has left communities shaken and law enforcement scrambling for answers. Who were these people? What drove them to commit such horrifying acts? And how did a group of highly intelligent, tech-savvy individuals turn into a deadly underground network? Tonight, we break down the twisted ideology, the brutal crimes, and the arrests that finally brought this reign of terror to an end. This is Up in Crime. The Zizian group didn't start as a violent cult. At first, it was just an online circle, a mix of programmers, philosophers, and activists who shared an obsession with decision theory, artificial intelligence, and radical ethics. They weren't outcasts. Many were well-educated, some with backgrounds in tech and science, but over time, their ideas drifted from abstract discussions to something far more dangerous. At the center of it was Jack LaSota, known as Ziz. A transgender computer engineer and self-styled philosopher, Ziz preached a belief system that blended extreme veganism, militant trans activism, and a warped version of rationalist thought. Her followers saw themselves as warriors in a moral battle, convinced they had uncovered a deeper truth about existence, one that gave them the right to reshape the world, no matter the cost. To them, the rules of society weren't just wrong, they were obstacles. Laws, ethics, even basic human instincts like empathy were things to be overcome in pursuit of a higher cause. And once a group starts believing that normal morality doesn't apply to them, it's only a matter of time before words turn into actions. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. The first attack. The shift from radical ideas to real-world violence wasn't immediate, but the warning signs were there. The Zizians operated in a world of rigid hierarchies, where those who fully embraced their ideology were seen as enlightened, and everyone else, family, friends, even former allies, became obstacles. Dissent wasn't tolerated. Those who questioned Ziz's teachings were cast out, branded as traitors or corrupted by mainstream morality. Ziz had a way of making people feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves. She framed their mission as a war, one that required absolute commitment. It wasn't just about ethics, philosophy, or even survival. It was about power. The power to reshape the world according to their own rules. And if that meant breaking the law, if that meant spilling blood, so be it. The first confirmed act of violence linked to the group came in Pennsylvania on New Year's Eve, 2022. It started as a family dispute, something personal, something avoidable. Michelle Zyko, one of Ziz's devoted followers, had been struggling to maintain ties with her relatives. They disapproved of her growing obsession with the cult, worried about the influence Ziz had over her. What happened next turned those concerns into tragedy. On December 31st, Richard and Rita Zajko were found dead in their Chester Heights home. The details were brutal. Evidence at the scene suggested the attack had been planned, not impulsive. Police would later link Michelle to the crime, and while she never confessed, those close to the family suspected Ziz's ideology had played a role. The idea that traditional morality was a trap, that survival justified anything, wasn't just something they discussed online. It had become real. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 2 years, the violence escalated. The Zizians moved from personal conflicts to targeting people they saw as threats, enemies, or obstacles to their so-called mission. And with each act of violence, their belief in their own righteousness only grew stronger. The second attack. The next major act of violence tied to the Zizian cult happened in Vermont. But this time, it wasn't a family dispute. It was a full-scale confrontation with law enforcement. On January 20th, 2025, near Coventry, a U.S. Border Patrol officer named David Malland was shot and killed during what should have been a routine stop. At first, authorities weren't sure what they were dealing with. The suspects fled the scene, and for days, investigators struggled to put the pieces together. But when they finally did, the picture that emerged was disturbing. One of the suspects was Teresa Youngblood, a known associate of Ziz. She had been living in an off-the-grid safe house with other members of the group, stockpiling supplies and avoiding detection. Law enforcement later found notes in her home filled with references to preemptive action and necessary force. To her, the Border Patrol agent wasn't just an officer doing his job. He was an agent of a system the Zizians believed had to be destroyed. This wasn't a one-off incident. Authorities now suspect that by this point, the cult had been preparing for larger-scale violence. They weren't just reacting to threats. They were actively looking for targets. And that became terrifyingly clear just days later, nearly 3,000 miles away in California. The third attack. In Vallejo, California, a landlord named Curtis Lind had been in an ongoing dispute with his tenants who, as it turned out, were deeply embedded in the Zizian group. Lind had been trying to evict them for months. Complaints from neighbors, unpaid rent, and increasingly bizarre behavior had all pushed him to take legal action. But as far as the Zizians were concerned, this wasn't just a financial issue. It was a war. On January 23, 2025, that war reached its peak. Lind was found dead outside his property, the victim of a brutal and frenzied attack. Witnesses reported hearing shouting, followed by what sounded like a struggle. By the time police arrived, it was too late. The suspects had vanished, but it didn't take long for investigators to link the killing back to Ziz's inner circle. At this point, authorities were starting to realize just how widespread and dangerous the group had become. What started as online rhetoric had turned into multiple acts of violence across 3 states. They weren't just radicals, they were killers, and they were getting bolder. But the question remained, where was Ziz? For years, Jack LaSota had been the enigmatic force behind the Zizian cult. She built a following through essays, blog posts, and online debates, using complex language and philosophical arguments to justify extreme beliefs. But now, with multiple killings linked to her ideology, law enforcement wasn't interested in theory. They wanted her in custody. The breakthrough came in early February 2025, when investigators tracked a group of Zizians to a rented property in Maryland. Acting on a tip, federal agents moved in. Among those arrested were Michelle Zajko, Daniel Blank, and finally, Jack LaSota herself. Even in custody, Ziz refused to back down. At her first court appearance, she made a series of bizarre statements, refusing to recognize the court's authority and demanding vegan-only meals in jail. She didn't see herself as a criminal. She saw herself as a martyr. And that was the most unsettling part of all. Because even with her behind bars, the question remains, how many others still believe in her cause? The story of the Zizian cult is more than just a series of violent crimes. It's a warning about the power of ideology, about how ideas, no matter how abstract or intellectual they may seem, can push people to justify the unthinkable. Ziz and her followers didn't see themselves as villains. To them, they were revolutionaries, fighting against a world they believed was broken. And that's what made them so dangerous. Even now, investigators are digging deeper, trying to determine just how far their influence spread. Were there other plots in motion? More acts of violence planned? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, is this really over? Because if there's one thing we've learned from history, it's that cults don't just disappear. They adapt, they evolve, and sometimes, even after the leader is gone, the ideas live on. This is Up in Crime. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you next time.